Hello, everybody. I hope you are enjoying this first ever Sounds of the Mountain Storytelling Festival online edition. It was going to be my first time to tell stories at this particular festival, and that would have been a novel experience for me, but now I have a extremely novel experience getting to perform for you from afar. Most of the stories that I'm telling on this particular festival are from file footage that I made some time ago, but it was never released. So you're seeing good stuff that nobody else has ever seen before. However, I am very thankful for this opportunity to address you directly and tell one story right now in a current time. This is made possible by Mr. Richard Almus and his company Una Media Productions. There has been a small army of volunteers to pull this festival off, and Richard is one of that army. Many times when we get into a stressful situation, like we find ourselves in right now, we want something familiar. And so I'm going to tell you a story that I come back to very, very regularly, at least yearly. Up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Miss Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit thrust a fork into a saucepan of potatoes. And then two young Cratchits, a boy and girl, came tearing in and screaming that down at the baker's they had smelt the goose and, knowing it for their own, went dancing about the table, basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, while Master Peter blew upon the fire so that the potatoes bubbled up and knocked against the saucepan lid as if they wanted to be let out and peeled. "Whatever has got your precious father?" said Mrs. Cratchit, all aflutter. "And Martha, that Tiny Tim. Oh, Martha weren't as late last year by half an hour." "Here's Martha," said a young girl coming in as she spoke. "Lord bless you, how late you are." "There's such a goose, Martha," said the two young Cratchits, who seemed to be everywhere at once. "We had a good deal of work to finish up last night, and then we had to clear away this morning, Mother." "Well, never mind," said the woman, helping her daughter with her shawl and bonnet and kissing her a dozen times. "Never mind so long as you're come. Here, sit down by the fire and have a warm, Lord bless you." No, said the two young Cratchits. "Here's father coming. Hide, Martha, hide." And so Martha hid herself. In came little Bob, the father, his clothes threadbare, but brushed and darned to look seasonable, and upon his shoulder Tiny Tim. Alas for Tim. He carried a little crutch, and his limbs were supported by an iron frame. "Where's our Martha?" said Bob, looking about. "Not coming." "Not coming? Not coming on Christmas Day?" Bob said this with a sudden declension in spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way home from church, and he had arrived rampant. Martha hated to see her father disappointed, even if it were only in jest, and she burst out from behind the closet door prematurely and threw herself into her father's arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did Tim behave in church?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. He grows thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and he thinks the strangest things you e'er heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people in the church saw him there, because it might be pleasant to them upon Christmas time to think upon who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and it trembled even further when he insisted that Tim was growing stout and hearty. And then, before another word was spoken, his active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and the two young Cratchits, his brother and sister, helped him to his seat, which was a stool in the chimney corner. Bob turned up his cuffs, as if they could be made to look more shabby, poor fellow, and compounded some mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, stirring it round and round, and then setting it upon the hob to simmer, while Master Peter Cratchit and the two young ubiquitous Cratchits were dispatched to fetch home the goose, with which they returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made gravy, hissing hot. Master Peter Cratchit mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and then mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons in their mouths lest they should shriek for goose before it was their turn to be helped. Bob took Tim upon his knee at a tiny corner of the table, and at last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. This was succeeded by a long, expectant pause as Mrs. Cratchit, glancing all along the length of the carving knife, prepared to thrust it into the breast. But when she did so, and the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, there arose a murmur of admiration all about the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the whole affair, beat upon the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he believed there never was such a goose cooked. Its flavor and tenderness, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it had made a sufficient feast for the entire family, especially the two young Cratchits, who were now steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit rose and left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take up the pudding and bring it in. Suppose it wasn't done enough? Suppose it should break in the turning out? Suppose someone had gotten over the wall into the yard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose? A supposition that made the two young Cratchits livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Whoops! Hello! A great deal of steam, and the pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day, that was the cloth. And then a smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to one another with a laundress's next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit re-entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, bearing the pudding before her, hard and firm like a speckled cannonball, and blazing with half a quartern of ignited brandy and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding! Bob said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as Mrs. Cratchit's finest achievement since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would admit she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everyone had something to say about it, all high praise. No one said, or even thought, that it was at all a small pudding for such a large family. Annie Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. Finally, the dinner was done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth was swept, a shovelful of chestnuts was laid upon the fire, apples and oranges were placed upon the table. Bob tasted the contents of the jug and pronounced it perfect. The entire collection of family glass stood on the corner of the table at his elbow, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. But they held the hot stuff from the jug just as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob poured it forth with beaming looks and passed it round, and then he proposed a toast. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." All the family drank the toast after him. "God bless us," said Tiny Tim last of all. "God bless us, every one." There was nothing of high mark in all of this. They were not a handsome family. Their clothes were threadbare, and their shoes were far from being waterproof. And Peter must have known, and most likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. And yet, they were happy, contented with the time, pleased with one another, grateful, and looked happier still in the sprinklings of the Spirit's torch. And Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially Tiny Tim, until the last. I'm sorry that time does not afford us a longer space for me to tell you that whole story. At this point, I have told that story more times than Charles Dickens did. He would go on public reading tours and perform that story from the stage. There is a story about Mr. Dickens that tells us one evening he was performing in England in a large auditorium with about 2,000 laborers, what we would think of as blue-collar workers, I suppose. He had insisted that all of the men be given the entire day off with pay so that they could come to the theater with their families and enjoy hearing the world-famous Charles Dickens tell the story of A Christmas Carol, which was immensely popular. He did not anticipate the reception that he would receive. When he got to the end of the story and he referred back to the character of Tiny Tim, and he said, "When Tiny Tim, who did not die," when he uttered that phrase, the audience burst forth with such a roar of applause and screams and shouts that he had to come to a full stop and wait before he could finish the story. The infant mortality rate was so ridiculously high among that population that there was hardly a family sitting in front of him who had not experienced great tragedy in their own home. And they wanted to show their appreciation for the beloved Charles Dickens, for what he was doing for them, for what he meant to them, for the spirit that he was endeavoring to keep alive. Many, many people have worked so hard to make this festival happen. They cannot hear your thunderous applause. So I want you to go to the comments below, and I want you to type in there in all capital letters, do it right now, "God bless you, everyone."
Thank you very much, Tim, for that sentiment, but hold that thought, because since our Camp Bethel, Virginia YouTube channel is rated for kids, the comments are turned off to protect the kids from trolls or whatever else. So instead of sending us a message through the comments, how about sending us an email, or even better, make a donation at one of the links below to either Camp Bethel or a tip to the performers. Thank you.
Well, for the Sounds of the Mountain Festival, I wanted to do some pieces that I know are new to the majority of you, actually. But I told my husband I wanted to do one that was an older one, and I let him pick. And this is his favorite one, so here it is. When I was growing up, there was a creek down by the Debtors, and I loved that creek. I've loved playing a creek. I still love playing in a creek. We have a creek on our property. I love creeks. And my mom used to tell me not to play in the creek, but you can't keep a kid out of water, come on. And so I would go down, I'd take off my shoes, and I'd roll up my pants, and I'd play. But if the bottom of my pants got wet at all, you know, the rolled up part, I'd ride my bike to try and dry them off. Well, Tommy and Laura, who lived up above the creek, an older couple, and we're going back probably 44 years, and at that time they were in their 80s. So they lived up above the creek, and they would ask me one day what I was doing, and I told them, I said, I'm trying to dry off my pants because I don't want my mom to know I was playing in the creek. Well, they thought that was hilarious. So what they would do is when I get done playing in the creek, they'd invite me up onto their porch for an icicle. You know, those beautiful icicles in the long plastic wrapping. that when you hold them, the juice melts. The juice, there's no vitamins in that stuff, but it's the unknown liquid, the mystery liquid. I love it. And I would sit on the edge of their porch. They'd give me one, and I'd swing my legs and dry my pants while I ate my icy. And I said to my mom, I loved watching them. I loved watching Tommy and Laura. They were just, I don't know, to a kid, they were fascinating. He would put his hand on her knee and pat it, and she'd look over at him, and they would just look at each other. I mean, like, for a period of time, without saying anything. And I'd watch them, sucking on that icy. I'd watch them, and they were saying something to each other that was only something that they knew. It was just, to me, it was incredible as a kid to see people communicate without words. And sometimes he'd touch her cheek, and she'd close her eyes and put her head down, as if he was taking her to some distant place of memory. It was beautiful. Well, one time I was talking to my mom about this, and I was like, I can really tell that Tommy and Laura love each other. And she goes, oh, I know they do. She said, because he says the 3 words to her that every woman wants to hear: I'll clean up. Well, one day I was sitting on the porch having my little icy, and my icy pop, I think they were called. And I asked them, I was about 8, and I asked them, I said, hey, I said, how did you fall in love? I want to know how you fell in love. And he reached over and touched her arm and said, I'll tell this story. He said it was 1916. I mean, we have to go back here because that's a long time ago that I talked to them, and they were older at that point. He said it was 1916, and he said people from all around knew that Laura was the best seamstress for miles and miles. And he said there was a woman that lived up in Locust Grove, Mrs. Stool. She had a little store, and she was a mean woman. She had a tongue so sharp she could trim a hedge, and she would squeeze her mama if she thought a nickel would pop out. He said that woman had to have the best of everything, the best of everything. And she had gotten some silk fabric and some handmade lace from one of the people that had stopped by her mercantile. Well, she put the call out for Laura to come to make her a dress. Well, Laura was ecstatic. Laura was ecstatic because making that money meant that she could give that to her mama, and they could put that up for winter goods. And that was a coming of age thing for a young woman. And she was thrilled about this. So the day came for her to go pick up the fabric and meet with Mrs. Stoll, and she pinned the hat on her head and took an empty basket and went down the steps and up the road into town and went into the store. When she went into the store, Mrs. Stoll came out from the back and said, Laura, come here. Well, Laura went into the back counter, and she put her basket on the counter, and Mrs. Stoll reached underneath the counter and brought out this silk fabric and this handmade lace, and she laid it on the counter. She said, Laura, there isn't a woman around that has a dress made of this fabric, and it shows everything. One wrong stitch, a pucker, a misplaced needle hole, I'll know it. Laura looked down at the fabric and fingered it. She touched the fine lace, and she was overwhelmed with the beauty of it and so excited to work on the dress. Mrs. Stoll began to tell her everything that she wanted done. Pin tucks down the front, perfectly flat, she said. She wanted the lace turned into a collar. She wanted rolled piping around the waist, she said, and an upturned hem, full skirt. Buttons covered down the back with the same fabric. She put the fabric, some of the notions, and the lace into the basket, told Laura to be quick about it. And she was. Laura went home, took everything out of the basket. Her mother looked over it and was just awed by the beauty of the fabric and the lace. And Laura set to work. She worked before she went to school. She worked after she came home from school. She worked late into the night by gas lamp, head bent, neck aching, calluses beginning to form on her fingers. She worked until the joints in her young hands began to ache, and then she was done. The day she was finished, she said to her mama, come look at the dress. Her mama came in, and she laid the dress out on the kitchen table. Oh, Laura, look at that dress. It's beautiful. Her mother examined it. She ran her fingers down the pin tucks. Oh, Laura, perfect. She examined the lace collar. Flat, Laura, it lays perfectly. It drapes out over the edge of that. Beautiful job. She picked up the hem, ran it through her fingers. Not one mistake. Not one pucker. She then looked at the rolled piping around the waist. Not a bit of frayed fabric showing. She said, Laura, this dress is perfect. Now listen to me. We all know how Mrs. Stool is. Don't you let her talk you down. $3.50 is what this dress is worth. All that you did, all of your time, the effort, and the beautiful craftsmanship, $3.50. Mama, Laura said, $3.50? Yes, Laura, $3.50, and don't you come home with a penny less, because this is worth every bit of that. Laura folded up the dress lovingly, put it in the basket with the leftover thread, leftover lace, and a few of the notions. She put it on her arm, went down the steps, up the dirt road, into town to the Mercantile. When she walked in, the little bell above her head attached to the door jingled. She walked in and Mrs. Stool came out of the back, a fake smile plastered on her face to greet the customer that had just entered, and she saw it was Laura. Laura, she said, come here. Laura walked back and she said, Mrs. Stool, your dress is finished. She put the basket on the counter and gently began to lift the dress out when Mrs. Stool grabbed it from her, gave it a hard flick, laid it out on the counter. She picked up the hem and ran it through her fingers and clucked her tongue. And then she ran her fingers down the pin tucks. And then she looked at the lace color. She dropped it and she looked at Laura and she said, the collar is wrong. I see puckers. The hem, there's holes where you misstitched. Laura looked at her and she said, ma'am, she said, I am sorry, but that is incorrect. She said, I did a fine job. She said, there is nobody else that could have done this kind of work and gotten this dress done as quickly as I did. And Mrs. Stool said, Laura, I'm going to give you $1.50 for your work. It's the work of a child. Laura looked at her and she said, Mrs. Stool, I have calluses on my fingers. I got this done faster than what you had asked for it, and I know it is perfect. My mother looked it over. She said, I know it's perfect. She said, $3.50 and no less. I will not leave with less than $3.50. Mrs. Stool looked at her and she said, you're a child. I supplied the fabric. I supplied the thread. I supplied the lace. What did you give but a few stitches in time? $1.50, Laura, or leave with nothing. The dress is mine. Laura stood there. And in the face of such greed, Laura in her youth withered. Her head dropped, her shoulders slumped, and she said, yes, ma'am. $1.50 it is then. And in her mind, she thought better to leave with something than nothing. Mrs. Stool walked over to the big brass register and hit the large buttons. The drawer popped out with force. She reached in and pulled out $1.50. Slid it across the counter to Laura, slammed the drawer shut, and she picked up the dress and held it to her chest like a selfish child and disappeared into the back. Laura took the money and put it into her pocket, put her hand through the now empty basket, and went out the door and down the steps. She followed the road towards home, but she did not want to go home. She took a left and veered off path and sat down on a large rock on the side of the road. The basket tumbled into the dirt, and Laura put her hand to her face and began to weep. Laura, is that you? Why are you crying? Laura looked up and saw that Thomas was standing there. She said, oh, Thomas. She said, it's Mrs. Stool. She said, I made her dress, Thomas. You know about the dress. I've told everybody at school about it. And she said, look at my fingers. I have calluses, Thomas, and my neck hurts from working late at night. She said, I've worked so hard. The dress is finished. And Mrs. Stool wouldn't give me what my mama told me to ask for. My mama told me to get $3.50, but she would only give me $1.50, Thomas. She said, I don't want to go home. My mama's going to be so mad. She said, Thomas, I don't want to go home. Thomas rose up and said, you know what? You wait right here. I'll be back. She said, Thomas, where are you going? And he said, Laura, you wait right here. I'll be back. We're going to get your money. And he turned on his heel and went towards his house. About 8 minutes later, he came back, and in his hand were 2 round brown orbs. Laura looked at them and said, Thomas, what are those? And he said, these are coconuts. My daddy got them from a man on a boat during his last trip, and I'm going to get your money back. And he unbuttoned his shirt, put the coconuts in his shirt, adjusted them, and said, I'll be back. He went out onto the road, up to the mercantile, up the steps. The bell dingled above his head. He went in and he ran his hand through barrels of beans. He counted the sunshine cracker tins standing at attention. Mrs. Stool was watching, and finally she couldn't take it anymore. Thomas, come here. Thomas went back and said, yes, ma'am. She said, what is in your shirt? Oh, these, he said. These are my gollywhopper eggs. My daddy got them from a man on a ship, and ain't nobody from miles and miles and miles around got gollywhopper eggs. We're the only ones with them, and my daddy said if I keep them close to me and I keep them warm, they'll hatch. And we'll have gollywhopper birds, and ain't nobody got gollywhopper birds. Put them on the counter, she said. Thomas unbuttoned his shirt and put those gollywhopper eggs on the counter. Mrs. Stool poked at them and prodded and touched them. And then she said, how much? Oh, these aren't for sale. My daddy told me that if I don't take care of these, he'll give me a whooping. She said, Thomas, everything is for sale. How much? Well, I guess if I get a good price, my daddy won't be too mad at me. $1 a piece, $2 total, ma'am, no less. She walked over to the register, hit the buttons, the drawer came out. She pulled out $2 like it was nothing, threw it across the counter, and snatched those gollywhopper eggs to her chest and went into the back. And Thomas smiled, rolled that money up in his hand, walked down the dirt road into where Laura was still sitting on the rock, her face stained from tear lines. And he said, Laura, look at me. Laura looked up, and Thomas held his hand out, and he said, put your hand out. She put out her hand, and he put the $2 and curled her fingers around him and said, Laura, this is for you. Take it home to your mama. Oh, Thomas, this isn't my money. I can't take this. He said, Laura, it's yours. It's from me to you. Just give it to your mama. Put it with your other money. She doesn't need to know. And in that moment, Laura fell in love with Tommy. He is already in love with her. Now, for about 2 weeks, Mrs. Stool walked around with 2 large lumps right at the top bustle of her dress, up against her skin, keeping them warm. And when they didn't hatch, she threw those gollywhopper eggs away and never said anything to anybody out of fear of humiliation. But that was not the end of Tommy and Laura. Tommy had his eye on Laura. Well, she was looking his way too. And don't you know what any fool could see? Cupid was pointing his bow at them too. They met between classes and wrote some love letters. He walked her home after school. And there on the porch stood 2 kids in love that didn't know what to do. And Tommy said, I'm kind of nervous, and you look really scared. Well, they don't teach a class on love. They'll forgive us if we're not prepared. But one thing I know about times like this is we'll look back and reminisce. Remember that day on the front porch we had our first kiss. Well, Tommy and Laura got married. The only thing they owned was love. And who would have thought that so soon would come a gift from heaven above? Laura said, Tommy, I'm pregnant. Well, as a matter of fact, there's two. And there on the porch stood two kids in love that didn't know what to do. And Laura said, I'm kind of nervous. And Tommy, you look really scared. Well, they don't teach a class on life. They'll forgive us if we're not prepared. But one thing I know about times like this is we'll look back and reminisce. Remember that day on the front porch I told you about our kids. Well, Tommy and Laura's on the front porch. They got great-grandkids running around. Tommy said, Laura, girl, ain't we blessed? But Laura didn't make a sound. Tommy took her hand and held it to his cheek and said, Laura, I'll always love you. And there on the porch sat a man in love. He didn't know what to do. And Tommy said, I'm kind of nervous and I'm feeling scared. Well, they don't teach a class on death. They'll forgive me if I'm not prepared. But one thing I know about times like this is I'll look back and reminisce. Remember that day on the front porch. Remember that day on the front porch. Remember that day on the front porch when I had my last kiss.
And my name is Wesley Schrader, and I'm the Camp Bethel's food service coordinator. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting Camp Bethel. We invite you to support Camp Bethel by donating to the links to the video. You can also tip the performers.
Summer was winding down like an old, tired top. The waves on the St. Lawrence River looked like roosting chickens at sunset. And the hopscotch board and marble circle drawn in blue chalk outside my front door had long been swept away. And those busy summer streets filled with boats and tourists were nearly empty now. Just the citizens of Clayton, New York, my hometown, were running the stop signs. It's September 3rd, and tomorrow's the first day of school. That night, I'm going to have to wash my hair and take a bath. Now, my mother's going to ruin my hair by combing it. She's made me a brand new dress and bought me some special order squeaky shoes. She's got me a composition book and 24 Crayola crayons and some number 2 pencils. She hands me a quarter wrapped in a Kleenex for my weekly lunch ticket, and I stick it and my lucky rabbit's foot into the pocket of my new dress. I'm 8 years old. Tomorrow, I start 3rd grade. The next morning, I jump up out of my bed, I run down the beige vinyl carpet runner, and I go into the kitchen. I have my usual bowl of Trix with 18 tablespoons of sugar on top. And then I run out the front door. I start to skip up James Street towards Clayton Central School, which is built a mile outside of town on a grassy, rolling plot of land. It doesn't take me long to meet up with some of my friends, and pretty soon we're a gang. And then we are just like a school of fish swimming towards the shores of higher learning. We all walk up those steep stone steps and enter the dark corridor that smells so good and gleams of wax. We all say goodbye until 3:15, and then I walk straight down that hallway. I wave to the ladies in the office. I say hello to Mrs. Meeks, our nurse. I go by the janitor's closet, and then I'm standing outside the doorway of my 3rd grade classroom. Standing in the doorway is my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter looks down at me and says, "Good morning, Regi." And as soon as she says good morning, it is. Mrs. Carter is very tall with black hair. I figure out she must have washed the night before too and put up in pink curlers. Well, how do I know? She's still got one of those pink curlers in her hair. She's wearing a shirt dress with the belt cinched so tight it makes her belly pooch out underneath. Then she has flat black shoes and sparkling cat glasses. She walks me to my desk, the last one in the first row. And as we're walking between the aisles, I casually mention to her she has a very large hole in her stocking. She stops, looks at the hole and says, "Wonderful! Now my fat has somewhere to go on vacation. I'm in love." Well, it doesn't take long for my other classmates to join us, and after we do the Pledge of Allegiance and hear the announcements, Debbie McGrath raises her hand and says, "Mrs. Carter, my grandma has a big poochy belly just like you." And Mrs. Carter cups her belly like an egg. She says, "Children, this is not a poochy belly. This is a pouch. Now, which one of you can tell me the name of a marsupial that also has a pouch? And which one of you can tell me the name of the continent that is also a country the marsupial lives on?" Whichever one of you can tell me that answer correctly, that child shall receive a kiss. Oh, I wave my hand like a puppy dog's tail. When I answer correctly, she blows me a kiss. I catch it and put it in my pocket for later. It doesn't take me long to figure out that Mrs. Carter is unlike any other teacher I've ever had. She actually likes kids. Instead of yelling at us and scowling and using a pointer, she sings and dances and tells jokes. In October of that year, Mrs. Carter is teaching us the mathematical concept of more than and less than. She takes a piece of white chalk and she draws the more than symbol on the board. Then, with a piece of colored chalk, she draws in an eye and a mouth so it looks like a fish's head. Then she takes that colored chalk, she draws a hook and catches the more than symbol. Now, children, more than and less than is a very simple mathematical concept. This is the symbol for more than. Now, you know that when you go down to the St. Lawrence River and you are fishing for bullhead off of the dock, you know if you catch 5 bullhead and your friend catches 3 bullhead, you have more bullhead than your friend. You have more than your friend. Do you understand? And we all go, "Oh, yeah, that's simple." And then she draws the less than symbol, and once again the eye and the mouth. But this time the hook does not catch the fish. "But," she says, and here she does an imitation of the Tin Man frozen in The Wizard of Oz. "But," she says, "if you go down to the river and your friend catches 5 fish and you only catch 3 fish, you have less fish than your friend, don't you? You have less than." Do you understand? Oh, yeah, very good. Let's practice. And she writes the numbers 1 and 2 on the board. Now, children, is the number 1 more or less than the number 2? And we all raise our hands. No. I don't want you to answer that way. I want you to pretend that you're fish. I want you to suck on your cheeks. And if 1 is more than 2, I want you to lean to the right. But if it's less than 2, I want you to lean to the left. Now, which is it? Or lean to the left. And then she says, "Now, children, is the number 12 more or less than the number 13? No. Let's do it the other way around. Is the number 13 more or less than the number 12? And we all lean to the right. And she keeps writing numbers on the board, and we keep leaning right and left. We're leaning and ticking and talking like metronomes. We're laughing so hard that Jack Maloney, the dentist's kid, falls off of his chair and cracks his 2 front teeth. When he leaves to go see Mrs. Meeks, our nurse, when she's outside the room, she looks at us and says, "Now, children, does Jack have more or less teeth now than he had this morning?" And we all lean to the left. When it's time for us to practice our multiplication tables, Mrs. Carter puts on the record of the bunny hop. 1 times 1 is 1 hop, hop. 1 times 2 is a 2 hops, hop, hop. That bunny hops so much until it finally figures out that 1 times any number is that number itself. Oh, we have a very strict routine in Mrs. Carter's 3rd grade. School starts promptly at 9 o'clock. And then we study something. And then we get to have a snack. And then we have to study something else. And then we get to have lunch. And then we go outside for recess. We come inside, Mrs. Carter reads to us. Then we have to study something else. And then it's time to go home. This routine is only interrupted on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday mornings when we have our specials: art, music, and gym class. On Tuesday, Professor DeStefano rolls his art cart into the classroom. Oh, I love art. The paste tastes great. He hands out plain pieces of paper, unlined, and large pencils. And then Professor DeStefano tells us to draw things like dogs and cats and trees and birds and stuff like that. So after we draw, then he goes around and he picks up each child's paper and he looks at it and he pays the child a compliment and then he puts it back down. But when he gets to my desk, he picks up my piece of paper and he puts it down and he doesn't say a word. So the next time he asks us to draw something, I label it like dog and cat and bird and cow, because obviously he can't tell the difference between a perfectly drawn cat and a perfectly drawn cow. One time when he leaves, Mrs. Carter says, "Children, always color outside the lines. It's much more interesting that way." And then she takes out her red lipstick and just puts it around her mouth. It always looks like she's just eaten a piece of fresh cherry pie. On Wednesdays, we go to Mr. Connor's music class. Oh, Mr. Connor is a short, round man who pounds the piano passionately as he stamps his foot. We all warm up to "The Halls of Montezuma" and 15 miles on the Erie Canal. Mr. Connor's eyes close when he listens to the records of the Mississippi Delta blues artists. And one time, when he plays the record of the flight of the bumblebee, he tells us all to raise our hands, and he takes out a long yardstick that he scotch-taped a plastic bumblebee. He tells us to pretend to be tulips, and he goes around and collects our nectar. That Christmas, he gives me a solo in the Christmas concert. My mother sews me a brand new dress. She puts sequins all along the hems, stars, moons, sun. And when I'm singing, I feel like I'm standing on a cloud. Mrs. Carter tells me I sing like a bird. On Thursdays, we go to gym class with Mrs. Brabaugh. Mrs. Carter tells us how lucky we are that year because we are going to study gymnastics, which she excelled at as a child. When we get into gym class, Mrs. Brabaugh has set up the trampoline. The first thing she does is teach us how to check somebody. That means that when somebody's jumping on the trampoline and going kind of crazy, and you put your arms up, and that signals to them that they can fall on you and save themselves. when it's finally my turn, oh my gosh, it's so much fun. Boing, 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 boing. Oh, my teeth kind of hurt when I fall. Boing, boing, boing. Oh, I think I pee-peed myself. Boing, 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 boing. Mrs. Bravo says, Regi, what time is it? Boing, boing. The clock is really high on the opposite wall. Boing, boing, boing. Mrs. Bravo, it's 10:30. She smiles, and my turn is over. Did I tell you that Mrs. Carter was a firefighter? Well, she was. I didn't even know that until spelling one day. On Monday morning, Mrs. Carter always gave us a list of 10 spelling words. And on Friday morning, we always had a spelling test. I liked spelling because I liked to practice it, and I almost always got 100. That week, she was teaching us the rule, I before E except after C, but mostly you just have to remember it rule. So she always said the word, put it into a sentence, repeated the word. That week she said, lie. I can't believe you told a lie. Lie. After the test, she told us to hand our papers forward and she would collect them from the first person in each row. The first person in my row was the most popular girl in class. She went to collect the papers. She rifled through them and said, may I have your test, dear? And the girl said, I handed it in, Mrs. Carter. She looked again. Well, I don't see it here, dear. May I have your paper? I handed it in, Mrs. Carter. You probably lost it. And that little lie that girl told was like a spark of flame that went looking for another place to light. It flew out of her mouth, and then it landed in the mouth of the boy sitting next to her. Yeah, Mrs. Carter, I saw her hand it in. You probably lost it. And then to another child, yes, Mrs. Carter, I definitely saw her hand her paper in. You must have lost it. And then soon the room was filled with, I saw her hand it in, Mrs. Carter. Yeah, she definitely handed it in, Mrs. Carter. Even I said I saw her hand it in. And guess what? I couldn't possibly have seen it. I sat way in the back. The room was filled with the crackling of our deceit. Mrs. Carter had a stricken look upon her face when she released us to go to lunch and then to recess. When we came back in, we all sat down. We always had to fold our hands on our desks and cross our ankles. We were waiting for Mrs. Carter to read to us. But on that particular day, Mrs. Carter did not have a book in her hand. She had a crumpled up piece of paper, a test paper. She looked at each one of us once we were quiet and she said, I found this test in her desk. So those of you who said you saw her hand it in were very sadly mistaken. You all get an F. And instead of reading to us on that day, we had to put our heads down on our desk. We understood the lesson Mrs. Carter was teaching us had nothing to do with spelling. Mrs. Carter read us the most wonderful books in 3rd grade. She read us The Velveteen Rabbit and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Oh, I love The Velveteen Rabbit because, well, I had a stuffed pink elephant that I thought was really real. And sometimes my brothers locked me in the closet, and I thought it would be so cool if I could get out the closet and they wouldn't have known how. But my favorite book by far was Charlotte's Web. On page 89, when Charlotte and Wilbur are at the fair, and Charlotte is too weak to lift one of her 8 slender arms to wave goodbye to Wilbur, I start to cry. Big, big, wet, sloppy tears fall down my cheeks and splatter on my desk. I drop my head into my hands. I start to think about my grandma Carpenter, who died in a house fire before I ever met her. I think about my cat, who last winter caught a cold and asked to be let out, but never asked to be let back in. I think about my father, who's almost always in the hospital now, and our neighbor. She's so old that my mother packs up bread and milk and eggs from our grocery store and has me deliver them. She tells me to sit with her and read her the paper while she feeds her cats. And I think about Old Yeller. As Mrs. Carter is reading, she walks down my aisle, and when she gets to me, she rubs my back. When the chapter is over, she leans down and whispers in my ear, "I know, dear. I know." I get very sick in 3rd grade. In January of that year, I come down with a really high fever that won't go away. I have to stay home. I have to sleep on the couch because I'm too weak to go upstairs to my bedroom. My mother, in between customers at Carpenter's grocery store, she wipes me down with witch hazel. Every single day, Dr. Folks, our family doctor, comes to visit me. I realize that he's taken a hypocrite's oath instead of the Hippocratic one because he's trying to kill me with penicillin. I don't know when I'm going to go back to school. I hear my mother talking on the telephone to Mrs. Carter, and she's saying she doesn't know when I'll go back. A few days after that, Mrs. Carter comes to visit. She's got a great big stack of get well letters in her hand. She sits down on the edge of the couch and she reads me every single one of the letters, and she shows me the pictures. Nobody has labeled what they've drawn, but I know what they are anyway. It's like a miracle. A few days after that, I start to feel better and go back to school. The year rolls on like a freighter towards the sea. I get glasses. I get chubby. My grades go up because I can finally see the board, but my spirits go down because the other kids make fun of me. Mrs. Carter tells me that I'm going to learn to read if I just stick with it. She lets me practice my multiplication tables in the back of the room by jumping rope. She makes me do my homework over again if I do a crummy job. She tells me I have to practice my cursive U's and V's at her desk until I get them right. Mrs. Carter teaches me so much more than math and science and penmanship. It's June 24th, 3:15 p.m. The last school bell of the year rings, and all of my classmates race out the 3rd grade door. But I linger behind. I walk up to Mrs. Carter. She's sitting at her desk. There's so much I want to say. There are so many things I want to ask her. Like, "Mrs. Carter, are you going to go fishing off the dock for bullhead this summer?" "I am." "Do you sleep with your glasses on, Mrs. Carter?" "I don't." "Mrs. Carter, why do mothers cry so much?" "Mrs. Carter, have you ever noticed that when you buy a cupcake from the store, the frosting looks like a man's toupee?" And you are the nicest, kindest, funniest, and best teacher I will ever have. But I don't say any of those things. Instead, I just stare at her. She smiles at me. Her smile is like a sunbeam. And finally she says, "I know, dear. I know." I skip out of 3rd grade. I say goodbye to Mrs. Meeks and the ladies in the office. I skip down James Street My sister Mary is waiting for me outside of Carpenter's grocery. She hands me the piece of blue chalk. I draw the hopscotch board, and she the marble circle. We're going to play those two games all summer long, until it's time for 4th grade.
Where's your favorite spot at Camp Bethel and why?
My favorite spot at Camp Bethel is at the Adventure Village, the Wilson Creek Adventure Village, because I remember when we built them, and it's just a really beautiful spot, and it expanded our adventure program at Camp Bethel. What's your favorite spot at Camp Bethel and why?
That's going to be the Ark because I'm always hungry.
My favorite spot at Camp Bethel is where the creek is dammed up at Far, Far Away. And that's my favorite spot because I love hiking there with my dog Rain and splashing in creek play.
My favorite spot at camp is probably New Bethel because when we have worships there, you can just really hear the sound from all around and it sounds beautiful.
New Bethel.
Yeah, my first reaction is to say the Deerfield Center, where we hold the Sounds of the Mountains Festival. But I need to go further back. Maybe the dining hall. A lot of good meals. But I really go back to my childhood when I was a camper at Camp Bethel. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, we would gather around the camp spring, which is circled with benches. And we'd have something we called morning watch, where we would have Bible study and prayer before breakfast and before the day started. One of my fondest memories of Camp Bethel, with many memories around that pond that stick with me to this day. I love Camp Bethel.
I would like to list the people that I would like to thank on this piece of paper. Otherwise, I will forget. Thank you, Walter Willits, for shooting me. Say you're welcome. And Walter is our head videographer, and our assistant videographer is Liam Irwin. Thank you, Liam Irwin. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric Oliver and Lucas and Simon and Arthur for being the audience. Yay! And thank you for watching. Thank you, Sounds in the Mountains Festival in Fincastle, Virginia at Camp Bethel for making this possible, for us being able to gather together and to come and tell stories for you. It's ridiculous and wonderful that we get to do this for a living. Like all of us, all of my fellow storytellers, we put all our eggs in the basket of being live performers. Thank you, Alan Hull. Thank you, Carol Hull, of course. Thank you, Camp Bethel Director Barry Lenore. Thank you, Program Director Jenna Malhalso. I'm sorry I said your name wrong twice, Jenna. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching at home. And I know that you're keeping social distance, and I'm going to sing a song now. And it is a great privilege to be able to do this for a living, even in these heady times. This is a song about telling stories. So, I have a feeling your dad tells you stories, right? Yeah, just be patient. And your grandparents. Tarry here, where the stories never grow old, and you hear something new every time they are told, and it comes clear. To tarry here, where it doesn't matter your age, and when we gather round the table, we all take the stage year after year. And tarry here, we're living now and we're all in this place, so be sure to smile at each passing face as it draws near. And tarry here, and then we all will see the me and you, the you and me. And as we leave these grounds, we can rejoice in what we've found. So tarry here with Catherine, Sid, Jackie, and Doc. And when we tell their tales, we stop the clock. I know they're here, they're tarrying here. and Tarry here. The stories never grow old, and you hear something new every time they are told, and it comes clear to Tarry here. Thank you, old church. Thank you, Sounds of the Mountains fans. We're so grateful. Bye.